Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Ethicast. I'm your host, Bill Coffin. Last November, the Bitcoin and digital currency news site CoinDesk published a report that raised concerns that heavyweight crypto exchange FTX, run by the so-called crypto king Sam Bankman-Fried, was overleveraged, and that its sister organization, Alameda Research, had solvency concerns. In the days that followed, FTX swiftly collapsed in a crypto equivalent of a run on the bank, wiping out thousands of investors and rocking the entire cryptocurrency world. Under intense scrutiny from the FTX collapse, Bankman-Fried was himself arrested about 2 months later under allegations that he looted some $8 billion from the FTX exchange servers. Bankman-Fried's trial took a month, and on November 3rd, just after 4 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty on 7 assorted fraud and conspiracy charges. Bankman-Fried faces a maximum sentence of 110 years in prison for his crimes. He will face a second set of charges next March that include alleged foreign bribery and bank fraud conspiracy. Quote, the crypto industry might be new. The players like Sam Bankman-Fried might be new, but this kind of fraud is as old as time, and we have no patience for it, said U.S. federal prosecutor Damian Williams of the verdict, which places Bankman-Fried among other infamous financial criminals such as Michael Milken, Bernard Ebbers, Bernard Madoff, and Jordan Belfort. With us today to discuss the ethics and compliance implications of all this is Ethisphere's Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Chair, Erica Salmon Byrne. Erica, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem at all, Bill. As you know, I have been eager to discuss this particular topic with you really ever since the trial got started.
On November 11th of last year, FTX collapsed, spectacularly so. On November 3rd of this year, Bankman-Fried receives his guilty verdict. That's less than a year. What can we take away from the speed with which the U.S. government prosecuted its case against Bankman-Fried?
So I think we can take away a couple of things, Bill. One is these kinds of corporate prosecutions, I think, have gotten easier in the digital age because there's more evidence that one can collect. If you think about things like approving expense reports using Slack emojis and some of the other back and forth that the government was able to unearth. I also think in a very analogous situation to WorldCom, the imposition of a bankruptcy sort of executor for FTX assisted the government when it came to the case because the government was able to have a party that they could work with. So from a timing perspective, I think you can think about this as being analogous to the WorldCom, Evers and Sullivan prosecutions, right? In terms of the ease with which the government was able to build their case. They also flipped a lot of executives in their pursuit of SBF, which is a kind of a standard prosecutorial tactic. The thing that I was most struck by from a speed perspective, though, was the speed with which the jury reached its verdict, right? The fact that it took them just 4.5 hours to unanimously convict him on all counts, or on the 7 counts rather, that is pretty striking, and it says something about how compelling the prosecution's case was.
Yeah, no lie. It'll probably take us longer, all told, to produce this episode than it will have taken that jury to find Bankman-Fried guilty,
Yep,
which says an awful lot, to be
it
honest.
does.
You had named checked WorldCom, and whenever there's a big case like this, I immediately default to Enron, WorldCom, Parmalat, that whole dark era, right, of all those massive wrongdoings. In terms of scope, severity, but most importantly, in terms of its ability to impact the landscape of ethics and compliance expectations going forward, where would you put this case, especially compared to all those others?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would put it, Bill, kind of in that pantheon of, corporate collapses, corporate frauds, particularly that harmed very good people who had done nothing wrong, right? You talked a little bit about the investor loss in this particular case.
Yeah.
That's always one of my takeaways anytime something like this happens, is the extent to which good people who were, trying to find safe places for their money ended up losing. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Alameda Research side of the house as opposed to the FTX side of the house.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think it fits nicely into that sort of trajectory. We could even go back further, right? You and I were talking in the lead up to recording this episode about how in some ways this is just the latest Dutch tulip craze, right? People have been chasing, fads like this since, since people became people, right? I mean, that's part of why
Yeah.
I like to remind ethics and compliance folks that they will always have a job, because we're finding new ways to do it, but the fundamental behavior underpinning it is basically the same.
So speaking of Alameda Research, a large part of this case was around the relationship between FTX and its sister organization. So can you explain that relationship? Can you explain like why it was so out of bounds? And most importantly, what can our fellow ethics and compliance professionals take away from that particular situation?
Yeah. I think in the age old phrase, Bill, of a picture is worth a thousand words. I would encourage anybody who has not taken a look at the Michael Lewis book on FTX to just pull up the org chart. Right? I
Mm,
mean, this thing is going to make your eyes bleed. It was the most convoluted,
yeah.
complicated. I mean, these guys created a sub, every time they sneezed. It seems like if you look at the org chart, it was an incredibly Byzantine structure.
Yeah.
I think there were very few lines of clear accountability. Anybody with a compliance title is like a 9 layers down in that thing, right? Even on something as important as KYC. The KYC team is even buried and also duplicated across the org chart, depending on which of the entities you're looking at. So, that lends itself to the opportunity for the founder to execute a lot of things that were at best ill-intentioned, and at worst fraudulent, when you have that level of lack of accountability and clarity in an org chart. And so if I think about what the opportunities are for us to take away lessons for the ethics and compliance professionals out there, it's really to take a step back and look at your line of sight, right? What is your line of sight up? What is your line of sight down? Do you have the necessary information to be able to see
Mm.
across your organization? Do you have the access to be able to see across your organization? Or are you, enmeshed in this web of reporting lines that will quite frankly make it impossible for you to effectively do
Mhm.
your job?
In cases like this, I always feel a little bad for the defense counsel because their job is so huge and they have their work really cut out for them. In this case, SBF's defense was that he was an executive who simply got in over his head and couldn't manage two multi-billion-dollar organizations. Now, of course, that defense did not hold water, but
Yeah.
let's pretend for a moment that it did. Right? Let's imagine a world in which there was no criminal intent here, but rather just a case of colossal incompetence. In such a world, what are the kinds of governance safety rails that would have prevented something like this from reaching the inevitable conclusion?
Yeah, Bill, I'm going to go back to that bananas org chart, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
that is probably governance rail number one, right? Who's responsible for which subs? What reporting lines do they have in place? What are the controls you have between the subs? Who's overseeing all of those pieces, right? If the more your org chart looks like spaghetti, the more likely it is that you've got elements of a shell game happening
Mhm.
somewhere across, that organization. And so I think part of the reason why that defense failed as spectacularly as it did is, there was just one name at the top of that org chart, and it was
Mhm.
his. And so, you don't do something that Byzantine if you are not trying to hide stuff or allow stuff that in a normal regulatory environment wouldn't be allowed.
This case was handled by the Southern District of New York, which is well known to everybody in the ethics and compliance space. But to those who maybe are kind of new to it, can you explain why this particular jurisdiction is such an important one, especially for cases like this?
Yeah.
And to what degree does this jurisdiction create high watermarks for the rest of the compliance and ethics space to follow?
So the Southern District of New York has a very long-standing tradition of successfully and effectively prosecuting white-collar corporate crime. Right? If you look at most of the interesting cases over the course of the last couple of decades, they have come into and out of the Southern District of New York. And so, if you're somebody who's operating in the ethics and compliance space, in particular, Bill, to draw a through line into one of the last Ethicasts that you and I recorded together on tabletop exercises with your board. Well, boy, would this be an interesting one to do with your board. Now, obviously,
Yeah.
the vast majority of people listening to this particular Ethicast are not, backdooring money transfers from one sister subsidiary to the other and things along those lines. But the oversight aspect of this, who was talking to whom aspect of this, those elements, I do think, are things that would make for a good tabletop exercise. And so anytime something's coming out of the Southern District, there's always an opportunity for a compliance team to take a look at that particular fact pattern and ask themselves, how could it happen here?
Mm-hmm. Now, as you said earlier in this episode, and you've said this many times before as well, that people are messy and unpredictable, and if that weren't the case, there wouldn't be a need for people like us, right?
Yep.
But even by that standard, in this case, we're seeing people being extremely messy and being extremely unpredictable.
Mhm.
So my question to you is FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried together, are they a kind of black swan event for ethics and compliance? Or is there something larger going on here you're seeing with attitudes towards criminality and accountability that we should be taking notice of?
Yeah, I think, Bill, there's certainly elements of this that you can pull out of the fact pattern and say, this was people being people, right? And what were some of the ways that we could have had better systems, better lines of sight, better governance rails that would have kept people from being people to this extent? But as you and I were talking about in the lead up to recording this episode, I also don't want to overlook the fact that the underpinning foundation upon which FTX was built is crypto, right? And crypto as a concept was pretty quickly turned to a dark place in many cases, right? We had, it was being used for arms trafficking, it's being used for trafficking people, it's being used for ransomware, right? Like this is a this is a shaky foundation upon which to build something, right? Even if the underlying, blockchain technology itself has so many fantastic potential applications, right?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful conceptual technological advance, but this particular application of it lends itself to a dark place.
Mhm.
So the foundation upon which FTX was built in the first place was shaky, right? They created a coin, they used it to get loans, to buy, other digital currency. They then, kind of ballooned from there. So, I don't want to over-index on this particular situation because of that aspect of, kind of the foundation upon which it was built. At the same time, a lot of really, normal, good people lost a lot of money. And so anytime that happens, we have to look really hard at the human aspects, right? What were the informal or formal systems that allowed FTX to fall apart the way it did and as quickly as it did, right? What were the backdoor conversations that kept people from listening to their better angels, right? How did this get set up in such a way to make it so easy for so many people to do bad things?
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of a great science fiction short story by the author Neil Stephenson that had been, gosh, published maybe 20 years ago called The Great Simoleon Caper. And it's all about what if you created a digital currency out of nothing with nothing to back it and what kind of havoc might ensue. And I remember it was quite a novel story when I read it. And it is exactly what has happened now with crypto in terms of funds being designed kind of out of bad intent or just with a real weird sense of value that to your point creates rather extensive shell games and kind of makes an environment that is intrinsically hostile to the precepts of ethics and compliance and good faith that we tend to govern business by above the table. So not entirely surprised to see this Bankman-Fried episode ending as the way it has.
Yeah.
um,
And I would also remind all of our listeners, it's not just SBF, right? That was the high profile trial. That's where a lot of the
mhm,
details came out. But the government flipped a whole bunch of people who pled guilty, right? So this was, this was a great example of, an organizational setup that allowed for just a complete fundamental lack of accountability. And when you allow people that much leeway, more often than not, they're not going to make the right choices.
Ethisphere is not really in the habit of dunking on companies or sort of pointing fingers. We're all about solutions and we like to look
Yep.
forward and point to best practices. So I guess I'd like to flip this a little bit before we bring this to an end. which is, crypto as an industry is in kind of a very nascent place.
Mhm.
There's a lot of prospective regulation around it. I'm reminded a little bit, believe it or not, of the life insurance industry and specifically the life settlements industry, which for a long period of time, life settlements were seen as kind of an outlaw product. Um, because nobody had ever imagined a product like that before, so it fell outside the regulations. And in time, that industry wanted to be regulated because that set expectations around it. It gave it legitimacy. It gave it a sense of certainty, and it really helped to cement it as a proper part of a larger industry. So I'm wondering,
Mhm.
with crypto, can you see that same thing happening where if we get a proper regulatory framework around cryptocurrencies in general, could that in time help to create a more solid foundation on which we can see better best practices in terms of ethics, in terms of compliance, in terms of governance, in terms of regulatory behavior?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, Bill, without question, we could see that outcome, and you can already see a certain amount of it in some of the conversations that we are hearing from people in the space who are pushing for a regulatory protocol, who are looking to the SEC to create regulations that would allow, the sort of regular involvement with crypto in some of the larger players in the space who are interested in offering crypto as an option to the people that have invested with them. So I absolutely see the likelihood of that. I also see the likelihood that the underpinning technological advance that led to crypto in the first place, the blockchain technology having more and more potential applications.
Mhm.
So I think your life, and I think that's a really good example of a path that this could potentially go down. And I hope that the spectacular collapse of FTX and the coverage of what happened there hastens that outcome, quite frankly, because the technology is here. The technology, it is happening, and so much like the push to regulate AI, I think we have to pursue the push to regulate crypto because otherwise we're going to continue to have situations like FTX.
Well, Erica, as always, it's terrific to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Bill. My pleasure. And for anybody out there who's listening, this is it's very easy to say, well, that could never happen here, right? But the takeaway, aside from sort of the rubbernecking that we all did around the debacle that was the collapse of FTX, the takeaway is ask yourself questions about your own org structure and whether you have situations where subs are being set up that would be deliberately obfuscating your line of sight.
To learn more about values based leadership, ethical culture, the social license to operate, and more, please visit the Ethisphere Resource Center at ethisphere.com and hit the Resources tab for a wealth of helpful videos, reports, and presentations. I'm Bill Coffin, and this has been the Ethicast. For more episodes, please visit the Ethisphere YouTube channel at youtube.com/ethisphere. And if this is your first time enjoying the show, please make sure to like and subscribe either on YouTube or on our podcasting platforms at Apple, Spotify, Google, and Amazon Music. Thanks so much for joining us. And until next time, remember, strong ethics is good business.